I think we're ready to continue. Everybody's with me. What do we know about the personal life of Occupant Consu? Well, we know quite a bit about the overall facts of his life, if not the details of his daily life. Occupant Consu was married at least 2 times. The order in which he's married is said to be inconclusive. However, they may be reasonably determined by the physical evidence of the remaining funerary artifacts. I've studied all of these artifacts carefully, the inscriptions on his coffin and sarcophagi, and what follows are my own conclusions. I should mention, though, that they agree with the conclusions of Egyptologist Morris L. Bierbrier, who studied the family history in great detail. The first wife of Occupant Consu was Nes Consu I. Like his mother, Taneshi, she too was a cistern bearer in the temple of Amun-Ra in Thebes. Her father's name was Hormat I, the treasurer of the pharaoh. Her mother was Galtsashinu II. Neskons I was of royal blood, and through her paternal grandmother, Tarwa, who was the great-granddaughter of Pharaoh Takalot I, son of Pharaoh Orsakon I, son of the Pharaoh Shoshenq I. This, of course, means that the children of Occupant Consu with Neskons Consu had royal blood as well. In Egypt, like most places in the world, blood is thicker than water, and royal blood is very thick indeed. Nes Consu bore Occupant Consu 4 sons, who all followed him as priests in the temple at Thebes. Nesser Amun II, Winifred II, Namek Para, and Besenmut II. We know that Nes Consu died before Occupant Consu. This is her funerary stela, Cairo A9449. It illustrates her standing before Ra-Horskhut in worship, embraced by Mot. Her outer sarcophagus, Cairo 41025 in the Cairo Museum. I translated the hieroglyphs on that sarcophagus as well as on the coffins of her 4 sons, which gave me the names of her father and mother. Occupant Consu took a second wife by the name of Muthotepti. We don't know a lot about her except that her father was a priest named Yuf-Oa. What we do know is that Yuf-Oa was the brother of Hormat. You remember that name, don't you? Hormat was the father of Nes Consu, the first wife of Occupant Consu. Therefore, Occupant Consu married the first cousin of his late wife. This is the funerary stela of Muthotepti in the Vienna Art Museum. As you can see, it's not in very good shape. The style of the stela is similar to that of Occupant Consu and that of Nes Consu, but the execution is far inferior. But there's more here than meets the eye. I just discovered this stela on the morning of the 3rd day of the writing of the Book of the Law this year. The spell inscribed upon this stela is very important, very unusual, and quite rare. But as I've discovered, it is not rare in the funerary artifacts of Occupant Consu and members of his family. But that is another story for another time. His second wife, Muthotepti, bore him 3 more sons. Hor-Saasi, whose name means Horus, son of Isis. Ahat, whose name means he who is behind the first, meaning that he was the second son that refers to his older brother. The last child was named Ankh-Pachered, which means the child lives. This probably refers to Hur-Parkrat, the child. Let's begin by discussing the dramatis personae on the stela. I'll give just a very brief explanation of each of them. First, there is Nuit, the goddess of the heavenly sky. She was conceptualized as a woman bending over the earth, her body studded with the stars. In this representation of her, you can see the bark of the sun god Ra passing over her body from sunset to dawn. Secondly, there is the image of the beheaded type, Horus of beheaded, depicted as the winged disc. On the stela, he's called Hadith. In the French translation of the stela, which Curley commissioned, the name is given as Hudit, because the initial hieroglyph of his name can have the phonetic value Hu, but it can also have the phonetic value of Bet, which is why modern Egyptologists render his name as Bektet. And that itself is worthy of a long discussion, but we don't have the time for that here. Seated on his throne is Ra-Horuit, or Ra-Harakti, as he's sometimes called, Horus of the horizon. This is the form of the god that communicated freely with Rose Crowley to announce the advent of the new year. On the stele of revealing Ra-Horuit sits on his throne. Directly behind him, we see the hieroglyph of Amenti, which means the west. The standard of the west is often depicted with just the ostrich feather on top, but this one is more detailed and includes the figure of Horus. In Coptic, the last form of the Egyptian language, this word is Amente. In the Coptic Bible, that word is used to translate the Greek word Hades, the place of death. Ra-Horuit is holding the Was scepter in his left hand. The word Was means dominion. In the Book of the Law, this is the hand in which Ra-Horuit declares, "My left hand is empty, for I have crushed an universe, and naught remains." You will note that his left hand is extended in front of him, while behind him, as we see, is the west. In ancient Egyptian, the word for left hand is Yapti, which also means the east. It is the place of the rising sun, the place of life, the place of beginning. He's extending the wand of dominion toward the east. Yet, even though he's a god of sunrise, he sits before the symbol of the west, the place of sunset, the place of death. This is because he is the god of the two horizons. He took the place of his father Osiris as foremost of the Westerners. I wrote about this in my first book in the chapter called Two Horizons. Before Ra-Horuit stands Occupant Khonsu with his right hand extended in the sign of summons. The word Amenti means the right hand, and it also means the west. Occupant Khonsu has died. This is his funerary stela. Thus he is shown advancing toward the west, the place of sunset, the place of death. Without consideration for cardinal directions, but as magical gestures, the right hand is symbolically is the hand of action, while the left hand is the symbolic passive hand. Look here. Occupant Khonsu extends his right hand toward the west, as I mentioned, but he has two right hands. In our terms, we would say that he's manifesting the fifth power of the Sphinx, his will to go. And he did not, in the words of the poet Dylan Thomas, go gently into that good night. He went with a purpose. He was doing his will. And some of you might ask, did the Egyptians always draw hands like that? No, they didn't. Now let's examine some of the other gods that are depicted on the stela, or which are mentioned by the text, or implied thereby. First, we mention Khonsu, since he's the god to whom Occupant Khonsu's life was dedicated. Khonsu of Thebes, where Occupant Khonsu spent his life, was a benign and helpful lunar god, child and integral member of the powerful Theban triad. His aspect shown in this slide gives witness to his ancient past in the Old Kingdom, in which he is a bloodthirsty god who assisted the king catching and slaying other gods so that the king might eat them and absorb their power. He figures prominently in a very famous hymn called the Cannibal Hymn. I don't think that anyone would want to mess with Khonsu. Amun-Ra was the most powerful gods of Egypt, one of the most powerful, the father god in the Theban triad of gods. He's a powerful god of procreation, as indicated by often being depicted with the head of a ram. His name means hidden, that is to say, that which is concealed or invisible. He was the god ever present in many forms. The Egyptians themselves called him Amun, rich in names. Here shown as a four-headed ram, he signified the all-powerful God of the four directions, which is to say, the entire world. But more than this, in this form he takes on the characteristics of Ba-Neb-Jedit, the great God of creation and motion, God of self-generation, who came forth as the fourfold male generations, from the Creator, the sun god Ra, as Shu, air, as Geb, earth, and as Osiris, God on earth. We will encounter him a bit later. The Theban triad consisted of Amun-Ra, Mut, and Khonsu. Here Amun-Ra is in his human form, wearing a crown surmounted by two tall feathers. Mut was the wife of Amun-Ra. She was the great mother and queen of the gods. She had her own cult temple in the southern part of the temple complex at Karnak. The son of Amun-Ra and Mut was Khonsu, here shown in his human form as a lunar god. Just as an aside, Mut's name is spelled with the hieroglyph of the vulture, which you can see. Over 100 years ago, the French Egyptologist rendered her name Maut, a spelling that Crowley used his entire life. So when you read Crowley and you see the name Maut, M-A-U-T, this is whom he is referring. Menthu was an ancient warrior god, often associated with Horus under the name Horus of the Strong Arm. His cult center was also at Thebes. He was depicted with the head of a falcon and often with the two tall plumes atop his head, which distinguished him from Ra and other falcon gods. The Greeks later identified him with Apollo. It is Menthu that Aiwass addresses in the fifth verse of the first chapter of the Book of the Law. Help me, O warrior lord of Thebes, in my unveiling before the children of men. Crowley mistakenly thought that this referred to himself. It didn't. In the 25th and 26th dynasties, when Akhenaten and Khonsu lived, Lord of Thebes was a title of Menthu. As my colleague H.B. Frater Superior of OTO stated, quote, any Egyptologist would read the Book of the Law as an invocation of Menthu, end quote. Lastly, we have Osiris, the Lord of the Dead. Having been slain and risen from the dead to take his throne in the Duat, Osiris was the god par excellence of resurrection. Egyptians would come to identify him upon death by affixing his name before their own. On the stele we read, the Osiris, Ankh and Khonsu. All men and women entering the afterlife called themselves Osiris, yearning to be resurrected from death, even as he was. It is rather like modern-day believers in Jesus who call themselves Christians. In the text of the Book of the Law, he's called Asar, which is very close to how his name was actually pronounced. The form Osiris is Greek. And at last we come to the translation of the stele itself. I'll move quickly through this because I realize I've kept you for quite some time. First, at the top of the stele, beneath the winged globe, are the words, Hadi, great God, Lord of heaven. Then the text directly over the head of Ra-Hoor-Khuit, reading from left to right, says, Ra-Hoor-Khuit, Master of the Gods. Directly across from that inscription are 5 columns of words which read from left to right. The Osiris, the prophet of Menthu, Lord of Thebes, opener of the doors of heaven in Karnak, Ankh and Khonsu, true of voice. As I mentioned before, the phrase true of voice is an honorific term for the deceased. It affirms that when he or she enters the hall of two truths to be judged, that they will be declared to be the one who speaks the truth. The tongue gives birth to the contents of the heart. To be true of voice means to be true of heart. The heart and tongue are thus in harmony and one with God. Now below the altar, which is covered with slices of bread, the sacrifices to the gods are described. Bread on the left-hand side, it says bread and beer, and on the right, beef and fowl. The bottom panel is divided into 5 horizontal columns. Within these columns is written spell 91 from the Book of the Dead, a spell for not restraining the basol in the God's domain. The term God's domain means the world of the afterlife. The purpose of this spell was to allow the basol of the deceased to have freedom in the afterlife, to come and go as it pleased. Think about that for a moment. The bottom 5 columns read right to left. The first column in the first 3 hieroglyphs on line 2 says, to be spoken by the Osiris, the prophet of Menthu, lord of Thebes, opener of the doors of heaven in Karnak, Ankh and Khonsu, true of voice. Thus, what follows is an incantation that the deceased would utter. Column 2 and part of column 3 read, O exalted one, may he be praised, great of power, basol, great of dignity, who terrifies the god when appearing on his great throne. Here begins the invocation that the deceased is to utter. Who is this exalted one, this one great of power and great of dignity? Well, first let me point out that the word for power in the first line is the word ba'u. This word can be also the plural of the basol. Note that the next phrase is basol of dignity, basol great of dignity. Pardon. Well, who is the basol great of dignity? He's Baneb Jedit, Ram, Lord of Mendes, the great god of self-generation, who came forth as the fourfold male generations from the Creator, the sun god Ra as Shu, air, Geb is earth, and Osiris, God on earth. And thus he's depicted with 4 ram heads. His name can also be read Basol of Mendes, as I said. Many gods of Egypt were often identified with him, but here it is Amun-Ra of Thebes, the great god of manifold creation. It is he to whom Ankh and Khonsu prays. The prayer continues with this section of line 3. Make a way for the basol, for the Akh spirit, or Ku, for the shadow. He prays that a path will be made in the afterworld for the 3 essential parts of his being, his basol, his Akh spirit, or Ku, and his shadow. We might conceive of these in our terms as soul, spirit, and shadow. But why the shadow? This is one of the most misunderstood concepts in Egyptology. He's not a ghost like someone would have you believe. Think about this for a moment. When do you cast a shadow? Only in the sunlight or in the moonlight or artificial light. And you only do so because you have a body. The primitive humankind, one of the great numinous experiences they had was that mysterious thing that followed one wherever one went. It was attached to the body in some intangible, magical way. In life, it was part of all living beings. Yes, you will say, a corpse can cast a shadow too, but that corpse is not animated by the soul or spirit that gives us life. And so Ankh and Khonsu prays not only for a way for his soul and spirit, but also for his shadow, that he might demonstrate, even in the afterlife, I am here, I am alive. As I said, the word for shadow in Egyptian is shuyet, and it's written with the hieroglyph of an ostrich feather sunshade. We pick up the end of line 3 and most of line 4 with the final lines of the invocation. I am equipped to shine forth as an equipped one. Make up for me a way to the place that Ra, Atum, Khepri, and Hathor are in. Ra, Atum, Khepri are the 3 forms of the sun god. The world came into being through Ra, formulated from Atum, creative God, sun god, before the elements were hurled forth by Ra. The god Khepri, or Khepra as Crowley called him, was creation, coming into being, recognized as the sun between dawn and noon. Hathor was the feminine aspect of creation and life, and as such, the feminine counterpart of Ra, the creator god. She was also the Lady of the West, goddess of the mountain of sunset, the entrance to the next world. Now at the end of line 4, continuing through all of line 5, is the personal seal, as it were, placed upon the invocation, the one invoking himself to the gods. The Osiris, Ankh-Amut, true of voice, son of one with the same title, Besen-Mut, engendered by the sistrum bearer of Amun-Ra, the mistress of the house, Aneshi. In true, typical Egyptian fashion, he pays tribute to his beloved parents, his link to the generations of mankind. Now let's turn quickly to the reverse side of the stela. I mentioned earlier that the inscriptions on the reverse side of funerary stela are rare, and this one is even more unusual than that. The top 5 lines of the reverse is inscribed with spell 30, a heart spell from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. It begins with line 1 and reads to the left. It was not only inscribed on scarabs placed over the heart of the mummy. A spell for not allowing a man's mind to contend with him in the God's domain. The Egyptian word in that spell, which I translate as mind, is the word hati. Those of you who have read some of the essays in Ora et Labora know that I translate that word differently from any other Egyptologist. It has been translated as breast, heart, full heart, and foreheart. I do not translate the hati as heart, but rather as mind or consciousness. I'll briefly discuss that in a minute. However, I have a forthcoming book entitled Sacred Spells of the Heart, in which I explain that with numerous examples from hieroglyphic texts. In that work, among the many hieroglyphic texts that I have translated, are numerous spells from the coffin and sarcophagus of Ankh-Amut, his sons and grandson. Many of the latter have never been translated before, and any that have are only available in expensive scholarly publications. Once it's published, I hope you'll find it interesting. Now, spell 30 also occurs on his coffin, combined with a variant spell 30b. I also mentioned earlier that the earliest example we know of that configuration is found on the sarcophagus of Ankh-Amut himself. Doesn't that make you think that this was a very important spell for our beloved Ankh-Amut? Absolutely. Let's see if we can find out why. The spell begins to be spoken by the Osiris, prophet of Menthu, lord of Thebes, Ankh-Amut. My heart of my mother, my heart of my mother, my consciousness of my existence upon the earth. In this invocation, the deceased appeals to his own heart that he received from his mother while in the womb. In this place, the Egyptian word for heart is gib, and the hieroglyph for it is an ox heart, not a human heart. The Egyptians felt it was disrespectful to show the internal organs of a human being, and none of their hieroglyphs do so. The ib is not only the physical organ of the heart, but it is also the seat of emotions and instincts. In this, it is rather like what we call the nefesh in the Kabbalah. But it is also, as the physical organ, it is the vessel for the hati, which is not just the heart, it's the metaphysical aspect of the heart. That is the intellect, the consciousness, the mind. The plural of this word means thoughts. And that's not disputed. It's important to note that after it was embalmed, the heart, or the ib, was placed back into the chest cavity of the mummy, unlike the other organs which were removed and placed in canopic jars. The exception to this was the brain. The embalmers would pierce the brain cavity through the nostrils with an antique swizzle stick, swirl it around a few times until the brain tissue was mush, and then drain it out the nose and throw it away. Do you think they believed thoughts and emotions came from the brain? No, they thought it was worthless. The appeal to the heart and mind continues in line 3. Do not stand against me as a witness. Do not contend against me in the tribunal. Do not oppose me in the presence of the great God, Lord of the West. The deceased knows that he has required to enter the hall of two truths and have his heart weighed against the feather of Mott. It is not required that his heart be filled with righteousness, but rather that his heart be empty of sin. He must stand before the 42 assessors, the judges of the dead, to hear his confession. And then he must stand before Osiris, the great God, Lord of the West. And he begs his heart not to bear witness against him. Another version of this plea is found in spell 30a in the Papyrus of Nu, and it adds the following line, quote, do not testify against me, saying, truly he did it, end quote. It makes you think that whoever wrote this original spell might have had a guilty conscience. Line 5 on the reverse side concludes spell 30. And here he adds an interesting line, just a little different than some of the other versions of this spell. He says, although I have been buried in the earth, in the great western side of heaven, I shall endure upon the earth. Many versions of this spell state that the deceased is a glorified being in the afterlife, a beautiful ox spirit, that is, a khu. Occupant Khonsu says that even though his body has been buried, he will endure upon the earth. That sounds to me like a declaration that he intends to appear on the earth again. Lines 6 through 11 contain another spell from the Book of the Dead, and this one is really important too. It's called a spell for going out in the day and living after dying. Can you see the continuity here? To endure upon the earth, to live again after dying. The prologue to this spell takes up almost all of line 6. It reads, to be spoken by the Osiris, the Sma priest of Thebes, Occupant Khonsu, true of voice. If you recall, one of the titles of Occupant Khonsu was Sma priest, clother of the god in the temple of Amun. This is an interesting choice for a title to display here, for the Sma priest had one of the most intimate relationships with the god in the temple. He not only was allowed in the Holy of Holies, but he was he who opened the shrine of the god, bathed and clothed the statue, and made the daily oblations to him to start the day. The body of the spell proper begins at the end of line 6 and continues with line 7. The beginning reads, O unique one, shining as the moon. You will recall that I mentioned earlier that Khonsu was a god of the moon. But here in this place, we have a very specific reference. It's right here at the end of this phrase. This word is Yah, and it means the moon. But please notice that this word has the glyph of a seated god at the end. This is called the determinative. It helps clarify what the word means. It's not just the moon. It's the moon personified as the god Yah. He was a god known from very early times, but by the New Kingdom he was absorbed and combined with Khonsu. Now here we must ask the question, why the moon? The moon is the brightest light at night, and it is a very specific aspect of Khonsu, the god to whom Occupant Khonsu's life was dedicated by his parents. The symbolic opposition here is very clear. The night is death. The day is life. He has just passed into the realm of death. At this moment, he dwells in the night, but yearns for the day. To whom does he appeal? The God who is the ruler of the night, the God of the moon. And thus he prays, May the Osiris Ankh and Khonsu go forth among this thy multitude to the outside. Now we must ask, the outside of what? The answer is simple, outside the tomb. He desires to be outside with a group that he calls thy multitude. Who is this multitude of the God? Let's wait for the next verse to see. Now I should add that some Egyptologists give this spell a very pedestrian interpretation. Stephen Quirk believed it to merely refer to the night prior to the funeral procession. I strongly disagree, for I see this as a magical spell, a prayer to walk beyond the tomb and once again join the living upon the earth. Now, with the final lines to be uttered by the deceased, we hear a passionate plea, Release me, ye who are in the sunlight. Imagine this now. You're hearing the voice of Ankh and Khonsu. Release me. In other words, free me from the bonds of death. Release me from the duat. Now take special notice of this. To whom does he address this plea? Ye who are in the sunlight. The word ye is plural, more than one. He is addressing that multitude we read about earlier. Well, who are they? The world of the living? No. They have no power to release Ankh and Khonsu from the bonds of death. Who then? Look here. This is the word for sunlight. Do you see something unusual about this word for sunlight? The word is Aku, which, as I said, means sunlight. But what about the determinative at the end of the word? That represents a God, a divine being. He's not talking about plain sunshine here, ladies and gentlemen. There's a wonderful play on words here. Aku is mentioned. It's connected to an ancient word that dates back to the pyramid text. Aku, which is written thusly in the archaic fashion of the Old Kingdom. It means glorified ones, those blessed ones, the transfigured radiant spirits who exist in glory, or as we might say, the immortal ones who live in light, life, liberty, and love. In Crowley's day, they would have been called the Khus. Ankh and Khonsu appeals to them to help him break through into the world of the living. The next sentence is short, and the speaker changes. The identity of the speaker is vague. The text gives us no clue. But this sentence is a command. It probably comes from the glorified ones to whom Ankh and Khonsu has just appealed for help. It reads, a command, remember? Open for him the duat. And the final declaration fills the remainder of line 10 and all of line 11. The speaker is again vague. However, from this context, it would appear to be the voice of the moon god to which Ankh and Khonsu addressed this prayer. It is a divine affirmation. Indeed, Ankh and Khonsu shall go forth by day to do all that he wills upon the earth among the living. Did the incantations of the Stèle really work? The ancient Egyptians prayed that their name would continue to be uttered on earth among the living, that they might live eternally. That is indeed one way this is achieved. Our loved ones who have passed on continue to live in our memory, and in a sense, they come to life when we utter their names. The name of Ankh and Khonsu is uttered daily around the globe in the Gnostic Mass of the OTO, and aspirants to AA also speak his name daily. But Ankh and Khonsu prayed for more than that. He prayed to break the bonds of the world of the dead and go at will among the living of the earth. With the advent of the Aeon of Horus, I wonder if he was, in some manner, present in Cairo on 3 days in 1904, when a voice spoke aloud to a stubborn, disbelieving magician and announced a new beginning. As that voice broke the silence after 2,500 years, men threw the warrior Lord of Thebes, was once again invoked to help the unveiling before the children of men. And that voice delivered unto us the book of the law. It wasn't a figment of Crowley's imagination or an expression of his substantial ego. History shows that the law was delivered in spite of Crowley at that time, who fought its message for years before finally yielding to the task that had been laid upon him. Crowley's own knowledge of Egyptology was minuscule, and it remained so all of his life. And yet there is evidence within the text of the Book of the Law itself that its author or authors possessed a living knowledge of the ancient Egyptian language, far beyond the knowledge of most people on earth at that time. Was Crowley the reincarnation of Wakaf and Khonsu? Or was there some identity between Aiwass and Wakaf and Khonsu? Crowley himself vacillated on the answer to that question. Clearly, in a sense, Crowley came to identify in a way with the character of Wakaf and Khonsu. But is there more? Personally, I believe there is more, but I can't prove it, and neither can you. I have only my intellectual observations and the witness of my eyes and ears. But concerning these things, I am bound to remain silent. You must decide for yourself the questions of the Book of the Law. Decide for yourself. And this is just one of the great mysteries that confronts anyone who would attempt to fathom the depths of the Book of the Law. Yet, where there are obstacles, there is hope. Ask and you shall receive. Knock and it will be opened unto you. Thank you for your time and attention. Before I go from the presentation, I'd like to make a short announcement, if I may. We are almost ready to release a series of ebooks based on my lectures. The first title is The Parable of the New Birth, and the first three ebooks will be the parables of Thelema based on Liber 65. This is the cover of the first book, which will be coming out very soon. We've just approved the final proofs for it, so we're very, very close. And it contains the lovely artwork of Annette Eustace Gray, and we're very proud of that. Here's the next two titles, The Parable of Pale Image and The Parable of the Hummingbird. They'll be released all as individual ebooks, and they'll be available to the public soon at a very, very reasonable price. And we hope you pick them up and enjoy them. Love is the law, love under will. Thank you for your time.